Okay, so for the two problems on the second study guide, for these problems you need to find the amplitude, the midline, and the period. And then we're going to draw a line segment from 0 to the period. And then we're going to divide that by 4. We're going to make some angles on the number line. We're going to look at our phase shift. And we're either going to add or subtract the values that we found on the number line, that we find on the number line, and then we're going to graph. So I kind of have the problem set up for you. It is y equals negative 2 cosine 4x plus pi over 6 minus 1. So the first thing you're going to do is find the amplitude, and that is just the absolute value of whatever a is. In this case, a is negative 2, and the absolute value of that is 2. The next thing you're going to do is find the midline, which is y is equal to negative 1. That is the vertical shift as well. And your period is 2 pi divided by b. In this case, for number 1, b is 4. So it'll be 2 pi divided by 4, which is pi over 2. So it takes from 0 to pi over 2 to complete one cycle. So then we're going to draw a number line, and we're going to go from 0 to pi over 2. And then we're going to divide pi over 2 by 4. That's the same thing as multiplying it by 1/4. And we get pi over 8. So we start at 0. We go pi over 8 units to get to the first pi over 8. We add pi over 8 to pi over 8. We get 2 pi over 8. We add another pi over 8. We get 3 pi over 8. And then if we add another pi over 8, we get 4 pi over 8, which is the same thing as pi over 2. So our angles before our phase shift are 0, pi over 8, pi over 4, 3 pi over 8, and pi over 2. The next thing to do is find your phase shift, which is negative c over the absolute value of b. In this equation, c is pi over 6, so it would be negative pi over 6 divided by b, which is 4. And that's the same thing as multiplying by 1/4. So it's negative pi over 6 plus a 4th is negative pi over 24. So we take negative pi over 24, and we're actually adding it to, we added a negative number, so we're adding it to the angles that we found by taking our period and dividing it by 4. So we get 0 minus pi over 4, which is negative pi over 24. 0 minus pi over 24, which is equal to negative pi over 24. Then we are adding pi over 8 and negative pi over 24. That's going to give us a pi over 12. Then our next angle is going to be 5 pi over 24. Our next angle is going to be pi over 3, and then 11 pi over 24. You take those angles and you put them in a t-table, substitute them for the x that's in the original equation, and solve for y. I'm going to let you finish that up. The second thing in our second equation, we have y equals 4 sine of 2x plus pi over 2 plus 2. Our amplitude is 4. Our midline is y equals 2. That's the same thing as the vertical shift. And our period is 2 pi divided by absolute value of b, which is 2 pi divided by 2, which is pi. So we go from 0 to pi. We take our period, divide into 4 parts, and that's going to give pi over 4 for each part. So it would be 0, pi over 4, add another pi over 4, that's 2 pi over 4, add another pi over 4, that's 3 pi over 4, and if we add another pi over 4, we get pi. All right, then we find our phase shift, which is negative c over b, which is negative pi over 2 over 2, which is going to give us negative pi over 4. So we're going to add negative pi over 4 to 0, pi over 4, pi over 2, 3 pi over 4, and 4. And we're going to get the angles of negative pi over 4, 0, pi over 4, pi over 2, and 3 pi over 4. And then we're going to substitute those into our equation to solve for our y value. So I'm going to leave that with you to substitute. And then when you finish substituting to find your y, then you need to graph both equations. Okay, for your second equation, it's a word problem. So what you want to do with the data is graph the data. And I actually graph the data in Excel. So if you put your information into Excel and go to insert charts. Well, you have to select the data first. And if you don't know how to do this, you can always look it up. But you would kind of put your data in first. One is the first month is January. The second month is February. You go all the way through December, which is the 12th month, and you put for January your Y value should be 29, for February 30, and so on. So you would highlight this in Excel. Highlight this, and then go to insert chart, and it would actually draw a graph for you. And this is kind of representing I'm going to say a cosine curve. We're going to actually model this data using a cosine curve. And just remember that the standard form of the equation is y equals a times cosine. Hold on, let me write that over. So it'll be y equals a cosine of bx minus c plus d. So we have to find a, b, c, and d to get our model equation. So the first thing we're going to do is find an amplitude. I have it small down here. I don't know if you can see this, but the amplitude is 1/2 times the max minus the min. The max is 74. The min is 29. So make sure you actually do what I did, but it needs to be uploaded to Google Classroom so you can get credit for it. So if you perform the operation or the calculation, you'll get 22.5. So that would be the amplitude. The period would just be 12 months because it takes from January to January to start over. So the period is just 12 months. The vertical shift or the midline is going to be 1/2, or let's take that back. It's going to be the max plus the min divided by 2. That would be 74 plus 29 divided by 2. You get 51.5. So this is the amplitude and not the amplitude. I'm sorry, the vertical shift and the midline. So far for your equation, you have y is equal to 22.5 cosine of bx minus c plus 51.5. And we can find what the b is because we know that the equation for the period is 2 pi over the absolute value of b, or just b in this case. And if we plug in 12 or substitute 12 for p and set that equal to 2 pi over b, we can just solve for b by multiplying b by both sides, and we're going to get 12b is equal to 2 pi. And if we divide both sides by 12, we'll get that b is equal to pi over 6. So now we have y equals 22.5 cosine of pi over 6x minus c plus 51.5. So now it's up to us to find what c is. So I'm going to do c just a little bit different. Normally I say take one of the points and plug in for c. When you plug in for x and y to find c. So this time we're going to kind of analyze the graph. We know that the maximum, let me write this down, data value, which is the y value on the graph, occurs when x equals 7. So we know that the max occurred in July. I'm just going to say July. Since the parent graph, which is y equals cosine of x, attains its max, or first max, we'll say the first max, at x equals 0, we can apply, a phase shift of 7 minus 0 or 7 units, because 7 minus 0 is 7. And we can use this to find C. All right, so we're going to say that my phase shift is equal to 7, and the equation for the phase shift is negative C over B. So we're going to say 7 is equal to negative C over pi over 6, which is the B part. Absolute value of that is just pi over 6. So to get rid of the pi over 6, we're going to multiply both sides by pi over 6. And the pi over 6 here cancel. I'm left with negative C. And then pi over 6 times 7 over 1 is going to give me 7 pi over 6. So we're going to divide this by negative 1. We're going to need negative 7 pi over 6 is equal to C. So that's going to be my C value. So now for my equation, I have y is equal to 22.5 cosine of pi over 6 x minus 7 pi over 6 plus 51.5. All right, and this is my model here. So this is my model equation. So I just answered the B part. So this is the B part. And the C part wants you to find the temperature when the time or x is equal to 8, or the 8th month. So that 8th month is August. So you just need to substitute 8 in for x. So I have pi over 6 times 8 minus 7 pi over 6 plus 51.5. So you're going to get a temperature in August, or the 8th month, of about 71 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is going to be your answer for C.